Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar on 10 costly mistakes in data integration projects. Presenting today is Kevin Scott, our senior consultant at CloverDX, and he's going to be taking us through the most common costly mistakes in data integration projects. And we're going to look at ways in which to recognize and avoid them in the future. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. Kevin's going to be answering questions at the end, so if you do have any, please use the Q&A box to submit them. We'll also be sending out the recording and the slides after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Kevin.
Great, thanks Tessa. And hello everyone, thanks for joining. As always, we're going to talk this morning about data and data integration. You know, our projects come in all sizes and shapes. It's safe to say no two are alike, but they do share, however, one thing in common, which is susceptibility to a set of design and implementation mistakes. So what I want to do today is walk through some common problems we've seen that you may encounter when you start a data integration project, prepare you to recognize and hopefully avoid them before you launch your next project. Now, it's hard to know how best to organize the list, maybe the most costly first or chronologically by project lifecycle. Wasn't sure, but have a lot to cover, so we'll just jump in. One common mistake we see is starting the project too quickly. Some people refer to it as the ready, shoot, aim approach. When deadlines loom, it's tempting to start making immediate progress. We've wasted too much time already and we're late getting started. Or we need to finish this project as soon as possible, so let's get started now and we'll lock down the requirements as we go. The danger here is wasted effort and a false sense of progress. When you rush in, you're likely proceeding without a firm set of requirements. And then when those requirements eventually surface or change, it can be expensive to go back and rework. There's cost in time and in schedule, but there's also emotional cost. No one on any team likes to go back and redo work. So try to have some objectives and measures in place at the outset and avoid that temptation to rush in. So we'll say we're not going to rush. Another common mistake is thinking about the scale of your solution. The temptation is often to focus on the current state, the current character of the data that you're going to be working with, both at its source and at its destination, and then to design a solution around that current state. That can be a mistake, as data that is the subject of your data integration project is so dynamic. I mean, your subject data will grow and probably change in structure and format during your project's life. That in turn can put pressure on any SLAs that you might be preparing to commit to. Maybe today you need to batch process in a 2-hour window, or maybe you need to handle 1,000 new data events per hour. Those numbers are rarely static. So it's important to consider that when you're moving, consider that as a moving target at the beginning. Okay, so first two mistakes. Don't rush in and spend some time thinking about scale. And when I actually apply those lessons to my webinar content, I discovered I've actually made them both, right? So I had 16 mistakes I wanted to cover, not 10. For the remainder, then, I'll categorize into 3 themes that I've identified, and then I'll try to describe the mistakes that I believe are in some rough order of importance or priority within each of those themes. So the first one, preliminary mistakes, things that can happen as you initially begin to define your data problem and your possible solution. I've already started with 2, right? Rushing in and misunderstanding the scope. Closely related to the scale or scope is misconsidering the lifespan of the solution that is going to be the subject of your project, right? Now, notice I'm making a distinction between the project lifespan and the lifespan of the data integration solution that your project is concerned with, right? Your project may have a well-defined lifespan with a solid target end date, but your data integration solution will not, and it can be a mistake to confuse those two. It's too easy to think of a data integration project or a data integration solution, I should say, as a one-off with definite end of life. The reality, I think we'll find, is that most data integration solutions are better off thought of as ongoing initiatives and simply just never done, right? This is particularly true for successful data integration solutions, right? Might be a bit counterintuitive, but the more successful your data integration solution is, the more likely people are going to want more from it. Even migrations, which we often think of as discrete or finite activities, have echoes. You think you're done with the solution, but then the business decides that some data was inadvertently left behind and actually want to go back and re-migrate or migrate some more. Healthy business processes continuously evolve, and the data processes almost always need to evolve in parallel. So don't confuse the end of your project with the end of the data integration solution that your project is actually creating. Now, there's a great marketplace of software technology for your DI project. Lots of tools offering impressive capabilities in ETL and data quality and data lineage, automation, orchestration, mapping. Some tools are going to help let you run on-prem. Others are going to be fully managed cloud services. Impressive tools to choose from, some with equally impressive price tags. So technology will be important, and you'll spend a significant effort evaluating and trialing and selecting the tool set for your project, which is good. But it can be a mistake to confuse the effort of choosing that tool with the effort of actually building the solution. The tools you use are going to make you more efficient, certainly, but the hard work of designing your data pipeline will still be hard work. No tool that we know of anyway is magic. So be mindful of what it is that the tool is going to be able to help you with and what it can't. Consider a situation, for example, with an organization maybe that over the years has built, a pretty rich library of SQL procedures to handle some data transformation. Then in a project, they introduce some tooling which can replace some of that SQL, as well as providing automation, providing some error detection, some alerting, more tight integration with other workflows. So the tool is bringing a lot of capability to bear, but there's still going to be work necessary to move the specific business logic from its current, SQL-centric implementation into whatever tool set that you have. As you define your data integration project, you'll need to think carefully about your end users and aligning with your end users. If your solution is not aligned with user expectation, either in terms of their needs or their capabilities, your success on your project is going to be limited. A misunderstanding of your users' skills or their willingness to learn, and you can easily end up with shelfware. You design a solution that might actually solve the problem, but your users think it's too difficult or too time-consuming to use. If you make the mistake of overestimating their needs, often you're just simply wasting effort, right? Building expensive features that work, but no one really has the need to use. If you misalign with your users by underestimating their needs, and you'll end up designing a tool that is unexpectedly in high demand, right? You designed a solution that is is actually much more popular than you ever envisioned it would be, gets used more often by more users than you'd planned, and maybe fails under load. Right? So take time to understand your users and align your solution to their skills, their work context, and of course their needs. Frequently, a data integration project does not start with a clean slate. It's much more likely that there are already processes in place that have been deemed, inefficient or insufficient. In other words, there's some pain. Maybe the current processes are too slow or actually broken and producing the wrong answer. Perhaps the original authors are gone, and the corporate memory necessary to maintain the current solution is lost. If you don't take time to fully recognize, understand, and memorialize the actual pain that's causing your project to be launched, is a mistake, right? Failing to understand that motivating pain, you risk building a solution that might actually be better in many dimensions, but not better in the ways that actually address the motivating pain. We've seen our share of projects where there's been technology changes or moving from on-prem to cloud that really didn't address sort of the root pain for why the project was initiated to begin with. So take time to translate the motivation for change into actual measurable objectives for your project. So those are the mistakes we see sort of preliminary: starting too quickly, having incorrect views of the scale or lifespan, maybe magically thinking about what any technology is going to be doing for you, not being completely aligned with your business user or understanding really the motivation for why you are actually here making changes to your data integration, pipelines. Right? So next batch of mistakes I'll move to is ones that we see happening as you assemble the team that's going to tackle your data integration project. Your data integration project is going to need a business owner, someone who understands the business goals of the project and can answer questions related to functionality and schedule. Essentially someone who has authority to change the project scope. Equally important, though, is that business owner needs to be actively involved in the project. Too often, business owners are figureheads, right? Attending a weekly status meeting or keeping just a passing interest in progress. It's a mistake to assemble your team without including a hands-on business owner, someone who is as committed to the project as the rest of the team. Passive ownership, attending weekly rubber stamp status meetings invariably causes project delays that will quickly accumulate and cause damage. Part of assembling the team is selecting the tool set. As I suggested earlier, there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the data integration tool marketplace. Choices are dizzying. So the conventional wisdom is to try to choose tools that will meet all of your data integration needs, not only for this project, but for any other project that might be going on now or for projects that might happen in the future. It's been our experience, though, that it is better to take a more measured approach to what you're going to expect from your tools. Don't insist on features that you don't need, say, in the next year, or that you're unable to use. Much better off if you focus on the core capabilities that will allow you to get your project goals accomplished the quickest, and minimize maybe the emphasis on what you might need sometime in the future. We've seen a lot of this The easiest example to mention is with big data technologies. Until very recently, past few years, it seemed every data integration project sort of added Hadoop, big data, at the end of their tool requirements list, seemingly regardless of any plans or ability to do big data analytics. So resist that temptation to insist on a tool that does everything. This one is one of my favorites. When you assemble your team for your project, they will of course be confident, smart, and all well suited for the job, and tempting to presume that your team members can learn new tools quickly themselves and don't really need any formal training, and we don't need to waste time and effort and schedule space for having formal training. We think it's a mistake. We've seen it be a mistake to skip this kind of training, and the reasons can sometimes be subtle. In formal training, you're going to pick up some tips and tricks that simply don't surface in your self-guided study. Formal training can often provide more than just tool expertise, but it can also be a source of domain expertise. And by domain, I mean data integration just as a general practice, right? Your vendor's training staff often has done many data integration projects and probably has experience with projects very similar to yours, which they can share. And establishing a personal relationship with technical staff from your vendor can actually be very valuable resource as you move forward into the execution phase of your project. I recall a group in our training center late last year. At lunch one day, the attendees had an impromptu whiteboard session, right, where one of our staff members sat with them and discussed, some detail of their upcoming project in a sort of very casual way. And in their own words, sort of after the training, they said that session, that impromptu lunchtime whiteboard session, was just as valuable as the entire rest of the class, right? Saved them a lot of time searching for the right design pattern and actually seeing some of the best practices presented in the context of their own specific application. So training can have value well beyond just that curriculum, right? But do take the time to choose your trainer carefully. Ask your vendor about the trainer and his background and experience, and make sure it's the right fit for your team. As you assemble the team for your DI project, you'll need to consider just how much help you want from a third party, whether it's services or tools or a combination. How much you want to DIY depends on all the expected constraints, right? How much, what's the skill set of your team and the availability of them, and how aggressive is the schedule. And of course, there's a spectrum of building it yourself or DIY options, right? Which parts of the project do you want to build yourself? Which parts do you want to actually buy or outsource? So spend the time necessary to choose where on that DIY spectrum to position your project, right? At one extreme, you can build 100% custom solution without any tools. Well, of course, you'll always use some third-party tools, right? Not many of us are going to actually build database software, but maybe you have a strong internal team of developers, and that team can make rapid initial progress on your project goals, the goals that address the pain that I mentioned earlier. The mistake, though, that we see with this approach is underestimating the other features or the assumed features, and I'm using air quotes now as I talk to you. These other features that surround a data integration solution that are often assumed, things like data quality assessment, logging and error handling, security, monitoring to make sure that the process completes successfully. Those are foundational features that can cause a DIY solution to quickly gain weight well beyond the core requirements that you started with, right? Now your programming team may be able to build those things, but is that the best use of their time. So maybe you want to retreat along the DIY spectrum, augmenting your project with an investment in tools or third-party offerings to handle some of this foundational work, and reserve your internal development resources to focus on those core business specific features. So the message here really is just to be cognizant of everything that you're asking your team to do in the DIY portion of your project. Closely related to that decision about where you place your project on the DIY spectrum is the assessment of the project's total cost. Misjudging costs is a common mistake, right? At the outset, it's very tempting to fall into the trap of equating the cost of the tools that you're bringing in with the cost of the solution, right? Remember, no tools are magic. It's important to recognize that the project cost is going to have a scope, much like the data that the project's working with. In addition to the cost of tool selection and the cost of development, right, you need to consider the cost of operating that finished solution, the cost of fixing bugs, opportunity costs when your solution experiences an incident. Almost every data integration project encounters some completely unexpected piece of cost, right? We know a logistics firm that undertook a DI project recently that included building a data lake. They chose MongoDB as the data lake technology. It had the right performance, and the license costs fit into the budget. It was only later that they discovered that MongoDB was not on the corporation's approved software vendor list, right? Now, it could be added, but not without additional certification costs, right? So each choice you make about the team and how you assemble the team and their tools is going to have some impact or on some dimension of the overall project cost. This one's kind of fuzzy. Working with the solution architecture or framework might not be a mistake in assembling the team, maybe more an execution mistake, but it's still important, and I do want to spend a moment talking about it. Your data integration solution, the subject of your project, is going to have some sort of software architecture. Data integration architectures can, of course, run from the very basic project-specific architecture to more generic framework-centric architectures. I want to be careful not to overgeneralize, so I'll just say in my data integration experience, the more DIY flavor a project has, the more likely it is going to tend towards choosing some sort of project-specific architecture, right? It's very unlikely that the DIY solutions consider some sort of generalized framework with any priority. It just seems like way too much overhead for most projects. And when I say framework, what I'm talking about is some sort of, generic approach to the architecture, right? So instead of maybe writing code that reads a specific customer file and inserts its content into a specific customer table, instead you create a framework which would read an arbitrary file and insert its content into an arbitrary table based maybe on some guidance in a configuration file, right? That's more of a framework-oriented approach. Frameworks like that can appear intimidating and unnecessarily complex, and initial progress almost always seems slow when you're doing it that way, compared to a more direct treatment or more project-specific approaches. The project-specific approach always is like a sugar high. You get to move fast and see results quickly, but in general, they end up being less flexible and less extensible. I also think that a framework, if you decide to go that direction, is going to be more likely to support corporate governance and auditability goals that we're starting to see surface a lot in corporate data environments, right? And they'll be of course more tolerant and even welcoming to business process changes, right? We see this scenario a lot where the architecture starts off as, project specific, but, sort of starts to fail under load, right? Companies maybe built a DI solution using project specific architecture, and it works great. So great, in fact, that there's a resulting increase in business, which is resulting in more and more variable data to process. And what happens is they start to see a linear relationship between the growth in the data that they're being asked to process and the growth in the effort required to process that data, right? So don't underestimate the value of a generic data integration framework, particularly if you expect growth in the amount or the type of the data that you think you're ultimately going to need to process. Right, so those are six areas where we see mistakes when you're assembling your team. Not having a committed business owner, maybe trying to buy too much technology. Don't skip that training. Be careful about where you put yourself on the DIY spectrum. Be careful, judging cost and all the places where cost can surface. And then, choose carefully about what kind of framework, software architecture you want to introduce as you start executing your project. Right. Then finally, third sort of general theme here is execution mistakes, the mistakes that you make as you actually start to build things. Right. First thing I'd like to talk about is how you might use or not use a POC. POCs can serve to confirm your planned approach, right? It can help clarify and validate your requirements, your needs. It can help characterize the known unknowns about your project and help you uncover the unknowns in your project, right? You need to make sure that any POC you do addresses, the entire project, regardless of whether or not each part is simple, right? You want to cover everything. If you're including outside consultants on your team, POCs are very helpful because they'll provide an important sort of early assessment, right? If your consulting team, if your outside resources can't deliver on the POC, you have to ask if they're going to be able to deliver on a whole much more complex project. But warnings about POCs, I guess you want to be careful how you represent a POC that you do to your business user or your stakeholders, right? POCs are great for validating requirements, but they can inadvertently convey a false sense of progress to a casual observer, right? They may think, they'll see your POC and they'll think a feature is done or near done, right? And then ultimately be disappointed weeks later when you show up at the status meeting with the final product and it seems like it's the same thing as the POC, right? So some things to be careful with as you include a POC in your data integration project. Transparency. Here, the goal really is just to avoid surprises, right, in your project. Demo as much as possible, as early as possible, to as many stakeholders as possible. No big reveals. And I think I can just leave it at that. You want to get status. You want to clear the air and make sure people understand exactly what things are going on and get any sort of misalignment uncovered and resolved, as nearest to discovery time as you can. When we start our data integration projects and start mapping out how they work, there's a tendency to focus on the happy path, right? The way we want data to flow through our data pipelines. Handling bad data is often an afterthought, and we think that can be a costly mistake, right? When bad data creeps into our systems, it affects credibility and it can be expensive to repair. So it's a mistake not to consider bad data handling as a core part of your project. Remedies can include, adding explicit validation stages, looking for bad data at various points in the pipeline so you can catch it as early as possible, defining processes that not only detect the bad data, but actually correct it automatically, right? We actually have an entire webinar that addresses this subject in our archives. Invite you to go back and have a look at that. And then finally, testing. I've left this as the last item on the presentation, which is, I think, a bit ironic because it's often the last item or final step in data integration projects, which is a mistake. Right? The biggest mistake we see related to this formal testing is the failure to obtain relevant and valid test data. The right test data is vital to ensure that your solution actually works. But at the same time, the right test data is often remarkably difficult to get your hands on, right? The best test data is actually production data, but that's almost always off limits because, well, A, it's production data and it's running on production infrastructure, and B, it may hold sensitive or GDPR constrained or protected personal information, right? So you're often left with synthesizing test data as the next best solution. You need to make sure that you plan and budget for that effort as well. We have an entire webinar on obtaining and manipulating test data that I recommend you taking a look at too, right? So execution mistakes, skipping a POC or not, but make sure you take advantage of the things it can do and be wary of the things that it can also do, right? Stay transparent during the process. Let everybody know where you are at all times, no surprises. And then really don't shortchange the processes for handling bad data, and certainly don't skimp on QA, particularly with getting the right kind of test data. Right, so my 10 costly mistakes turned into 16. They're all listed here in summary. I'm sure you've seen many of these, and some of them will probably seem quite obvious, but I hope at least a couple of them have given you something new to think about. We've been helping clients plan and execute data integration projects for almost 20 years. So we're happy to have the opportunity to talk to you in more detail about your upcoming data integration projects, how we can help you identify the challenges that you might encounter, and how you can avoid some of these mistakes. So thank you, and back to you, Tessa.
Thanks, Kevin. We've got a question that's come in. So someone has asked, which one of those pitfalls would you say is the most dangerous in your opinion?
Well, I think it's the one that's top of mind for me. So seems like the most dangerous is underestimating or failing to plan for having the right kind of test data. That's specifically unique to data integration projects, which are all involved, with getting your data from wherever it is to wherever it needs to be. There's a lot of data movement and a lot of places where data misbehaves, and having accurate test data is vital, which is not necessarily surprising, but what is surprising to a lot of people is just how hard it is to get your hands on the right kind of test data, right? It's almost every company has controls over their data, and it can be really difficult to set up and obtain that data. And that can actually really wreck a project towards the end, right? You can be making great progress on features and do your proof of concepts well and stay on schedule and keep your business owner happy. But when it comes time to actually prove that the thing works and actually run it with real live production data, and you want to do those tests, you run into unexpected, the last 5%, I guess, of your project. That last mile can be really full of obstacles when it comes to getting test data and the right kind of test data.
So yeah, thank you for the question. If there aren't any more, I think we'll wrap up for today. But if you do have any more, we've got our email on screen there, hello@cloverdx.com, and we'll ping those over to Kevin. So yeah, thanks Kevin for a really interesting webinar, and thank you all for attending. We'll ping the email, the slides and recording in your inbox soon, and hope to see you at our next webinar.